Every day another door closes, but a new one opens again. Whoa, every way we travel must end, but there another road begins. Whatever you've seen, haven't you heard?
I'm really trying to race through this stuff. I assume that you've all been home drawing with every free moment, you know, practicing your figures and getting all those, the major components of the body put together. So I'm going to be talking about the architecture of the body, and particularly foreshortening, because that's always a really hard problem to deal with. In dealing with foreshortening, I'm not going to talk too much about the ideas of perspective, but I assume that you'll have a basic understanding. So every so often you get a pose where there's something that is sticking toward you that is actually larger than the part that's behind. And unless you're doing something sort of to emphasize that, it's really something that you should probably ignore. One of the things that is so hard to deal with in the foreshortening is you're used to looking at the figure sort of straight on like this. And like in the catalog drawings, almost all the people are going to be, presented fairly directly toward you. And so the issues of foreshortening don't really come up. But obviously in the poses, you'll have some body parts sticking toward you, and it becomes really hard to figure out how to deal with, this very odd arrangement of flesh. So what I tend to do is to first of all start with the head, because almost any time you draw a figure, there's going to be a head somewhere. So I'm just going to use that as a pose. So let's say the model is draped in such a way that they're upside down, and you have no idea where to start with this. I would generally start by trying to put in some figure that represents the head. Even though obviously you can't even see how the head is oriented, at least that gives you something to start with. And then beyond that, it's really hard to tell from this where those three components are. So I want to point out the four most important joints in the body, and those would be the shoulders and the hips. But these are really important points to, especially in a situation where you have foreshortening to deal with, because you can always find where the shoulders and the hips are. So here we have this figure. What's the first thing you do? Well, what I do is look for that gravity line. So I want to figure out how am I going to orient this on my paper. And what I see is the head is here, and it looks to me like the hips are directly above the head. So I just want to orient in this direction. Even though we know that people's heads are above their hips, in this situation, you're just trying to turn it into a visual formula. And here is where the environment can actually help, because in almost all the environments we're in these days, there are vertical lines. So like all around the studio here, there's vertical lines, the corners, the door frames. As long as you don't look at that door frame, it'll kind of make you a little bit seasick. But in an old building, sometimes there are exceptions. But generally, everywhere we go, even outside, there's going to be vertical lines. So I can look at the pose, and I know that all the vertical lines are going to be poking right straight up. So this is the gravity line. And so I know that hip is going to be up there somewhere. And then what do? Well, you start looking for those other markers, which in this case are the hips and the shoulders. This bone that sticks out is called the great trochanter, and it's the one you're always bumping into in the dresser in the middle of the night. You can almost always find that on the model, even in a pose like this where the bone isn't sticking up. You can tell where that bone is going to be. So what I tend to do is draw a circle to represent that hip joint. And the same with the shoulders. Because the head is attached so closely to the shoulders, they're, for the most part, going to be equidistant. They're not going to be too far from equidistant from wherever the head is. So in this case, you can clearly see that this shoulder's over here somewhere, and that one's maybe over here. So if you can imagine where the spine might be, then you can begin to just determine in your head how these elements orient with each other. So this has got to be equidistant from the other side. Even though you can't see any markers at all on this particular pose. Then the next thing I would do is start triangulating the actual shape of the figure. So for instance, I want to look at the angle between the head and this outstretched knee. So I hold up my pencil, I figure out what that angle is, transfer it to the paper, and it ends up being like this. And then maybe I'll do the same thing with the hip and the knee. And let's just say in this case, I'm going to go from the bone. So what that does is it gives me a map of where that knee should be. And the same with these arms. This arm attaches here. I can see a joint right there. That's probably actually the best marker on that pose. And then knowing that the two halves of the arm are about the same distance, if I want to, I can put the rest of the wrist up here somewhere. And the other one, I think I drew that arm a little short, but you do the same thing, figure out the angles, and when you triangulate between the different points of the pose using your pencil, you can kind of lay that onto your drawing, and then you've got a little bit of a map you can start with. And then you can go back and start thinking about these components. So in this kind of a pose, the hips are going to be kind of vertical like this, and you're looking straight down on them. So do you remember this famous World War I poster, the Army recruiting poster in which Uncle Sam was saying, "I want you," and pointing right at you? What we see is the finger in front, the hand is something like this, the forearm is down here, and the shoulder is up there. In foreshortening, everything gets squeezed together. And so the way to make sense of it is to create a kind of a map where you know where those major points are. So we've got here the two shoulders. Looking at that, I think that second hip is down here somewhere. So that at least gives us a little bit of an indication of where these immovable components are. And then from that, you can start extrapolating. So even though you can't use your proportion chart directly, you can use the information in it, like knowing that the limbs are going to be divided in half. So that doesn't really help on this pose, but that's the kind of information you're using. Part of what your memory is of the construction of the body, and partly you're looking at the form before you. So in this kind of a pose, it's just sort of a pile of flesh. It's really hard to make a distinction of where things are. But every so often, you'll see some little marker, like you can see the belly button here. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea of where the front of the body is. And when you start putting all those pieces together, then you can start laying the flesh on. There's another thing I wanted to mention about the vertical lines. Inside of a room like this, all the vertical lines are going to be parallel to the gravity line. But the horizontal lines, it's much harder to get a reading on them because in this dimension, we're changing a lot. You sit down, you stand up, you sit on the floor, and all the horizontal lines change. So it's a lot harder to use that. But keep in mind that if you're perpendicular to the horizontal line, like I'm perpendicular to the middle of this wall, then all of those lines are going to be horizontal. As soon as I turn, then I get this perspective effect where the horizontal lines begin to converge in the distance. So as long as you keep that in mind, every time you see a wall that you're perpendicular to, all those horizontals are something you can use. Another pose, and you're trying to figure out how is that related to the gravity line. One way to do that is to compare the pose to a perpendicular horizontal and see where the elements are. So you can take a measurement like from the head to this knee. And actually, this is really easy because it goes right through that hip bone. Or if you want to compare the knee to the bottom of the butt right there, that's almost a horizontal line. So that's the kind of thing, if you start thinking about the environment, that will help you to align where the parts of the figure are. So in this case, I would start with this head, and then figure out where those angles are, like I just talked about. And if you can get the shoulders and the hips put in place, then at least you've got a map that matches the shape that you're seeing. And with the shape, with those points on it, then you can begin to construct, okay, this is where the spine is. So that means because the spine is in the middle, you know, these components have to be centered on the spine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
It looks to me like you're working with triangles all the time.
Well, that's just to get the measurements right.
Right, yeah.
And I'm really an advocate of not training your pencil. You know, you can spend a lot of time, you know, taking measurements and making sure all the measurements are correct. What I really encourage you to do is to try to feel the figure from the inside out. And so a lot of times, what I'll do is try to get my body into a pose that I'm looking at so I can feel where the tension is. And that helps me to understand, oh, I see, you know, there's a big curve in that spine. And especially with sculpture, if I can get myself into the pose, I know where the tension is. And the points of tension actually are going to appear in the drawing. So if you have a place where there's an angle difference, like the difference between the pitch of the hips and the pitch of the shoulders, there's going to be tension right in here where the major part of the movement is. And it's really helpful for trying to figure out, for instance, how far does this leg extend from this part of the figure? So let's say you determine that this elbow is right underneath the skull. You know, you can use that line and then start taking measurements like, is this a horizontal line or does it go down a little bit? So that's about the best we can do when it comes to foreshortening. And then if you can move forward from there, the next thing I want you to keep in mind is the body is full of this kind of internal movement. And you know, I talked about the fractals last week. We talked about the spiral and the S curve, the egg shape, the convex curve. Let me get those right. Convex. You know, the outward moving curve. So one thing that is helpful to me, I don't know if this would be helpful to you, is thinking about the body being just an empty shell, like this sculpture that's out in the front room of the woman's figure. You know, that the inside is the same shape as the outside. So it's all hollow on the inside. If you think about like taking a bucket of water and throwing it into the inside of the figure, the water's going to slosh around in there with this kind of natural movement that to me very much replicates what's happening in the real architecture of the body. So for instance, let's say that we're pouring water into this leg. There's going to be a slosh of water that comes over this way, runs into this wall, and then cascades to the other side and runs into that wall, and then cascades back this way. And so this kind of movement happens over and over, and it happens in kind of a spiral way. And so that's another fractal that applies to every single part of the body. So even down to the distal phalanges, they still have this internal movement. So when you see the pile of flesh, you have a certain map of where the major points are, like the great trochanter or the acromion process is this bone up here, the shoulder bone. Those always are, they have a certain proximity to the rest, to the core of the figure that never changes. The distance from here to the spine never changes. And so the only movement there's going to be is a little bit of tilting this way. And of course in foreshortening, the two shoulders come together into a single point. But that's where, hopefully, if you figure out where the spine is, you can see, okay, they're both going to be equidistant from the attachment of the spine. Incidentally, here's a trivia question. Does anybody know where the arm's attached to the skeleton?
Yeah. In the shoulder blade? Like in the corner of the shoulder blade there?
You would think so, but actually, the only place it attaches is right here at the collarbone. So that's where your arm's attached to your skeleton.
Wait, when you say attached, what do you mean?
Here's where the solid connection is, bone to bone. All the rest of it, the whole shoulder mechanism, is all free floating. So that whole thing, the ball and socket, the shoulder blade, all of that is free floating on top of the rib cage.
So it's muscle that's...
It's all muscle that's just held in there. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Is that the clavicle?
Yeah, so the attachment is right here. So I want you to to get in your head this idea that even though what you see is a pile of sort of amorphous flesh and it's hard to make sense of it, there's always going to be movement inside of it. So when you put together the form, try to keep in mind these fractals, that there's going to be S-curves in each part of this. There's going to be spirals. There's going to be convex curves. There's going to be egg shapes. And the way that the muscle groups come together is something that's called wedging. So the muscles fold into each other, they're like woven. And every place that one muscle group attaches to another muscle group, there's going to be this folding. So like the thigh, the top of the thigh folds into this one. And here's this overlapping, like the series of mountains when you're driving over the pass and you look over and you see the folded mountains on top of each other. That's that wedging process. So there's a bigger group wedged into a smaller group. And they are, both of them kind of spiraled into each other. So when we think about the construction of the body, there's all of this movement, but it follows certain patterns. And the patterns that we talked about, the fractals, are what's most helpful to me to think about how to construct those forms. So here's an example of kind of subtle foreshortening. You're not looking at the whole body crammed into one sort of blob, but he's got this folded arm. And so obviously, if the arm was full length, the wrist would be about down to here. But it's folded up, and so that the wrist is the whole arm is shortened by that much. So the way to deal with that is to figure out where the bones are. In this case, the shoulder and the wrist. Put the shoulder there, should be the easiest thing to do. Figure out from the stature of the figure where the wrist is, and then you can divide that distance, and that's where the elbow is, because the elbow is going to be half of the distance between these two.
But if it's foreshortened, depending on how low or high you're sitting in relationship to him, the elbow might not be in the middle.
Well, yeah. In this pose, yeah, if the one part of the arm is toward your eye,
Right.
then you can't use that.
Okay.
So again, you have to think about the architecture of the body, and sometimes those facts, like the equidistance of the upper and lower part, if they're foreshortened by the same angle, then you can use that information. And if they're not foreshortened by the same angle, you have to go back to the triangulating business and trying to measure with your pencil. And the reason why I don't like to emphasize that is it's pretty easy to kind of train your pencil how to look. What I want you to do is be able to train your eye how to see the pose and translate that into information that you put on the paper. So it's much better to have a sense of the aliveness of the person and kind of have all these rules way in the background. It's like stuck back in the library where you can go back and check it if you need to. But if you look at a pose and it doesn't, what you're seeing on the paper doesn't match the figure, that's the first thing to do is start triangulating. And one of the things that does for me is it gets me out of the idea that I'm dealing with this kind of unified biological figure, because that's the way I tend to think of the figure. It's just this one kind of mechanism that all works together. And all of a sudden you're looking at your drawing and you're seeing something way off. What the triangulating does is it gets you out of your biological brain into your math brain. And then all of a sudden you have a different perspective for looking at it. And I'll talk about a couple of more of these tips maybe in the next class about ways to check the drawing by kind of leaping out of being present with the figure. So I want to talk briefly just about the aspect of line that I talked about last time. Each one of these is a different way of using the line to express a different thing in the figure. So this one, the line is really lively. It gets really heavy and it disappears in other places. The line itself has a kind of story. Here's one in which there's almost no line. It's almost all just value. And in fact, I kind of didn't draw the arms. They're probably curled behind the head somewhere. But to me, the drawing is all about the monumentality of the form. So I'm hardly using line at all, it's just about form. Here's one that's just almost all gesture. The lines are really inaccurate. It's just very scribbly, but still you can get a feeling that there's a lot of movement. You can see where the pose is. Sometimes I find that leaving out part of the figure is really helpful. You know, that the human imagination is so remarkable. You really can't, your brain can't stand to have kind of a mystery, an empty story. So if part of the figure is missing, your mind sort of fills it in. So it feels like you know where that leg is, even though you can't see it. And that's a really cool thing about art. It's hard to do. It's hard to leave stuff out. This one's all about the shadow again, and it feels a lot more emotional to me. There's not very much detail, but there's a lot of being lost in the values. And it totally brings a different feeling to the drawing. I'm not going to be talking too much about value in this class, but that's something I love to use. Here's another same thing. You know, not a lot of delineation. It's just a lot of mood. This one, it feels like there's a lot of emotion in there, and there's a few lines that give a lot of purpose and motion to it. So it's not so much delineating the figure, it's delineating the motion. So it's almost like a drawing of the movement rather than the form. Here's an interesting drawing, kind of using the shaded areas, the shadow areas, like a landscape. So there's texture and movement inside the shadows, which is, you know, it doesn't make any sense biologically, but it makes sense to your emotion. This one, I think the background has about as much motion as the foreground.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of makes the figure disappear into a lively world. You know, that this person is like dancing to really great music or something. So that the environment actually becomes a bigger deal. So all of that is basically what you can do with the stroke that you make on the paper. So once you get the form kind of mapped out the way you want to do it, what I tend to do is think about what I want to pull out of this figure. You know, what am I trying to emphasize? Is it the beautiful musculature of this person? Is it a particular kind of mood? Is it a way that the figure fits into the environment?
Well, and for instance, that one, you really emphasized the hand, which was out kind of closer to us. But there was much more detail than that, so where the emphasis is, where do you want the eye to go?
Yeah, there's so many different ways of dealing with that. There's innumerable ways of throwing focus one way or another. One is through detail. One is through contrast. One is through kind of completion. And I'll try to find some examples, and we'll cover that stuff next time.
Whoa, every way we travel must end, but there